Something appeared that should not have resolved the way it did, not because it was intense, not because it was extreme, but because it was complete. It did not form slowly. It did not evolve. It did not struggle into existence. It appeared already finished, and then it stopped. There was no continuation, no degradation, no second instance to compare it to. Just one occurrence, isolated in time, behaving as if it had no obligation to repeat itself. That alone is enough to deserve attention. Before we go any further, pause for a moment. If you want content that focuses on real recorded events that refuse it to collapse into simple answers, follow the channel now. If you believe uncertainty is more valuable than certainty, like the video, and if something about this feels wrong, incomplete, or unsettling as it unfolds, leave a comment. Those reactions usually matter more than explanations. Now listen carefully. At first, nothing about the event demanded attention. It did not announce itself. It did not disrupt anything around it. It did not exceed expected limits. In fact, it blended in almost perfectly. And that is how anomalies survive. Anything that is too loud is flagged immediately. Anything too chaotic is filtered out. What remains are the things that look ordinary enough to pass through unnoticed. This was one of those. Its behavior stayed within a narrow range. It did not scatter. It did not fragment. Every measurable aspect aligned with the others. Timing supported structure. Structure supported intensity. Intensity supported duration. Nothing contradicted anything else. That internal coherence is rare, not impossible, but rare enough that it slows dismissal. Most false detections reveal themselves quickly. They wobble. They misalign. They expose inconsistencies when examined more closely. This did not. The longer it was observed, the more stable it appeared. That stability was unsettling, not because it proved importance, but because it removed excuses. When something is chaotic, it can be dismissed. When something is inconsistent, it can be corrected. When something behaves correctly, dismissal becomes difficult, so it was treated cautiously. No immediate conclusions were drawn. No interpretation was attached. It was recorded exactly as it appeared, and then it was expected to happen again, because repetition is the foundation of understanding. Things that matter tend to repeat, even briefly, even imperfectly. This did not. Time passed. The same conditions returned. The same parameters were active. The same observational window opened. Nothing appeared. No weaker version. No distorted echo. No partial return. Just absence. And absence, after structure, is not neutral. Absence creates tension, because structure implies cause, and cause implies recurrence. When recurrence fails, explanation stalls. This is where most anomalies disappear. They are quietly categorized, archived, forgotten. This one wasn't, because nothing about it behaved like a mistake. Mistakes leave fingerprints. They show edges. They expose system limitations. This exposed nothing. Every re-examination returned the same result: clean, stable, unresolved. No sign of malfunction. No indication of interference. No evidence of contamination. Just a single, complete event. That creates a problem, because science can tolerate ignorance. What it struggles with is isolation. An unanswered question can exist. An unrepeatable event resists explanation entirely, so the event entered an uncomfortable space. Not error, not discovery, something in between. A recorded occurrence with no narrative. That may sound insignificant. It is not, because narratives are how understanding progresses. When something resists narrative, it exposes a boundary, not in technology, not in measurement, in expectation. We assume meaningful things repeat. We assume significance announces itself. Neither assumption is guaranteed. The universe does not align itself with our frameworks. It produces events according to conditions we may intersect only once. This event may not have been rare. It may simply have crossed our observation briefly and then continued beyond our reach. or it may depend on conditions we do not yet recognize as relevant. Either way, the implication is the same. We observed something without context, and without context, even perfect data becomes inert. That should bother you, because it suggests that detection does not equal recognition. It suggests that our instruments may be recording things we are not prepared to understand, not because they are complex, but because they do not match expectation. We filter reality aggressively. Anything that does not fit existing models is averaged out, reduced, or removed. This survived that process by coincidence, because it looks just normal enough. That coincidence matters, because it implies that other events may not survive. They may be filtered out, misclassified, erased without ever being questioned. This one remained only because it sat precisely on the edge of normality. That edge is dangerous, because it represents the boundary between what we notice and what we miss. And boundaries are where important things hide. This event did not prove anything. It did not demand interpretation. It simply existed once, fully. And that is exactly why it still matters. Not as evidence, but as a reminder. A reminder that observation is not comprehension. That recording something does not mean understanding it. And that the universe is under no obligation to repeat itself in ways that make sense to us. If something like this can appear once, fully formed, and vanish without explanation, then the question is no longer what it was. The question becomes how many similar events have already passed unnoticed, filtered out, dismissed, erased, not because they were meaningless, but because they did not repeat on demand. The reason this event cannot be dismissed as coincidence has nothing to do with how strange it was. Strangeness alone is meaningless. The universe produces strange outcomes constantly. Outliers exist in every data set. Rare alignments happen. Coincidence is not a forbidden explanation. What matters is how coincidence behaves. Coincidence is unstable. When multiple independent factors align by chance, they tend to leave inconsistencies behind. They produce rough edges. They create statistical fingerprints that betray their randomness. This event did not. Every measurable aspect reinforced the others. Its timing did not fight its structure. Its structure did not fight its duration. Its duration did not fight its intensity. Nothing pulled against anything else. That is not what coincidence looks like. Coincidence is messy. It overshoots in one dimension and underperforms in another. It compensates accidentally. It creates imbalances. This was balanced. Balanced enough to appear intentional, even if intention cannot be inferred. That distinction matters, because intention is not required for structure. Structure only requires constraint, and constraint implies conditions. The question is not whether something meant to happen. The question is whether something was allowed to happen under specific conditions. This event behaved as if it existed comfortably inside its conditions. It did not strain them. It did not violate them. It did not push boundaries. It fit. That is deeply important, because accidents do not fit environments perfectly. They collide with them. This did not collide with anything. It passed through observation cleanly, without disturbance. That suggests compatibility. Compatibility does not imply origin, but it does imply legitimacy. And legitimacy removes coincidence as a comfortable explanation. Another reason coincidence fails here is duration. Coincidences cluster at extremes. They are either extremely brief or excessively prolonged. They spike and collapse, or they linger chaotically. This did neither. It existed for exactly as long as it needed to. Not long enough to drift, not short enough to fragment, just long enough to complete itself. That is unusual, because coincidence has no sense of completion. Completion implies boundary conditions. Something began, something ended, cleanly, and nothing leaked beyond that boundary. Coincidence rarely respects boundaries. It spills. This did not. Even the absence that followed behaved unusually. When coincidences end, they often leave artifacts, residual patterns, secondary effects, after images. This left nothing. No echo, no degraded repetition, no transitional behavior, just a clean absence. That kind of disappearance is not dramatic. It is precise. Precision is not proof, but it is pressure. Pressure on assumptions. Because if this was coincidence, it was coincidence that obeyed rules more cleanly than most deliberate processes. That inversion matters. Another reason coincidence struggles here is isolation. Coincidences tend to cluster. If one rare alignment happens, similar alignments tend to appear elsewhere in the data, even if less cleanly. Noise repeats itself in families. This did not have a family. No adjacent events. No near misses. No partial similarities. It stood alone, completely isolated. Isolation is rare in random systems. Randomness generates neighborhoods. This generated solitude. That solitude is difficult to explain away, because isolation requires exclusion. Something happened here that did not happen elsewhere. Not before, not after. Only here, only once. Coincidence does not usually respect location. It respects probability. Probability spreads events. This event did not spread. It was confined. Another problem with coincidence is reproducibility. Even rare coincidences become reproducible statistically. You may not reproduce the exact outcome, but you reproduce the class. This class did not appear again. Not weakly, not partially, not distorted. The class itself vanished. That suggests specificity. Specificity implies selectivity. Selectivity implies conditions that were briefly satisfied and then lost. Coincidence does not usually care about conditions. It happens despite them. This happened because of them, even without knowing what those conditions were. And that leads to the most important reason coincidence fails. Coincidence does not age well. The more time passes, the more coincidental explanations weaken. Because new data accumulates, patterns emerge. Outliers either get absorbed into noise or elevated into understanding. This did neither. Time did not resolve it. Time only hardened it. The longer it remained alone, the stranger its isolation became. That persistence of isolation is not dramatic. It is quietly corrosive, because it undermines confidence in dismissal. Dismissal relies on time. If enough time passes without consequence, we feel safe ignoring something. Here, time did not provide safety. It provided discomfort. The event did not decay into irrelevance. It remained suspended, unresolved, unclassified. That suspension is not accidental, because data is always being reprocessed. Old records are revisited. Methods improve. Assumptions change. This event survived all of that unchanged, not reinterpreted, not absorbed, still alone, still complete, still unexplained. That suggests resilience. Coincidence is fragile. It collapses under reinterpretation. This did not. Another subtle issue is symmetry. Coincidences tend to be asymmetrical. One side of the event is clean. Another is messy. One metric aligns. Another breaks. This event was symmetrical in behavior. Its beginning made sense relative to its end. Its internal progression made sense relative to its boundaries. There was no lopsidedness. That symmetry is not something coincidence optimizes for. Symmetry is expensive. It requires constraint across dimensions. Randomness does not enforce that. Constraint does. None of this proves intention. That distinction is critical. It does not suggest purpose. It suggests permission. As if the event existed within a narrow window where everything aligned just enough to allow it to pass through observation once, and only once. That framing matters because it removes drama. This is not about messages, not about signals meant to be received. It is about intersection, about two systems briefly overlapping and then separating. That happens constantly in nature, but rarely with this level of cleanliness. Usually intersections leave marks. This left almost none, except its own existence. And that existence cannot be reduced without strain, which is why coincidence fails here. Not because coincidence is impossible, but because coincidence would have been easier, messier, louder, more forgiving. This was not forgiving. It was exact. Exact enough to survive. Exact enough to resist. Exact enough to remain. And that exactness forces a shift in how this event must be treated, not as an anomaly to explain, but as a boundary marker, a marker of where current frameworks stop working comfortably, not because they are wrong, but because they are incomplete. That incompleteness is not dramatic. It is ordinary. It is how understanding progresses. But it always begins with events like this, events that cannot be dismissed, not because they are spectacular, but because they behave too well to be accidental. Events like this are rarely important because of what they reveal immediately. They matter because of what they refuse to reveal. Most discoveries announce themselves by fitting into something we already understand. They extend a model. They refine a theory. They sharpen an existing edge. This did none of that. It did not extend anything. It did not refine anything. It simply sat outside. And that's how entirely new categories usually begin, not with answers, but with resistance. Resistance to explanation, resistance to dismissal, resistance to absorption. When something cannot be absorbed into existing frameworks, the instinct is to treat it as a defect, a measurement problem, a methodological flaw, a statistical accident. That instinct is usually correct, but not always. Sometimes the defect is not in the data. Sometimes the defect is in the categories. Categories are efficient. They allow us to compress reality into manageable shapes. But efficiency comes at a cost. Anything that does not compress cleanly is treated as waste. This event was nearly compressed. Nearly. It fit just enough criteria to survive, but not enough to belong. That liminal position is uncomfortable because it forces a choice. Either the event is meaningless or the framework is incomplete. Most of the time, the first option wins, not because it is more accurate, but because it is safer. Incomplete frameworks are dangerous. They imply revision. They imply uncertainty. They imply work. So anomalies like this are left alone. They are not erased. They are parked. Parked data accumulates quietly, and sometimes, years later, patterns begin to form around it, not because the event changes, but because the surrounding understanding does. This is where categories break, not explosively, not publicly, but internally. The moment arrives when an old classification no longer feels sufficient, and this event lives precisely at that pressure point, because it cannot be explained within existing categories, yet it behaves too coherently to exist outside them. That contradiction is fertile. It suggests the presence of a missing category, not a better explanation, a different one. Categories do not emerge fully formed. They begin as discomfort, as phrases like, "This doesn't quite fit," or "This is unusual," but this event generates exactly that language. Not panic, not excitement, unease. And unease is a signal. It indicates a mismatch between observation and expectation. When mismatches persist, categories eventually expand. But that expansion requires accumulation. One event is not enough. Two events are coincidence. Three events become a pattern. This is the problem. This event is alone, which means it cannot create a new category by itself. It can only sit at the edge, waiting for something else to arrive, or waiting for understanding to catch up. That waiting is not passive. It exerts pressure, because every time similar data is filtered, this event becomes a reference. Not consciously, but structurally, it changes thresholds. What once would have been discarded now receives a second look. What once would have been erased now hesitates. This is how categories begin to shift, quietly, without announcement. The first anomaly never explains anything. It only destabilizes confidence. That destabilization is subtle. It does not feel like discovery. It feels like irritation, like a splinter in an otherwise smooth surface. You can ignore it, but it is still there. Over time, the presence of that splinter changes behavior. Reviewers become cautious. Analysts become conservative. Filtering becomes less aggressive. And that is when the second anomaly survives. not because it is clearer, but because the system has been softened. That is how unseen categories emerge, not through revelation, through erosion. This event represents the first erosion, a single point where certainty thinned. And that is why it matters more than events that are immediately explained. Immediate explanations reinforce existing frameworks. Delayed explanations weaken them. This has not been explained, not because it is complex, but because it does not yet belong anywhere. That absence of belonging is not random. Nature rarely produces truly unique things. Uniqueness usually reflects incomplete sampling. We assume uniqueness because we have not yet seen enough. But incomplete sampling is itself revealing. It tells us something about access, about windows, about intersection. This event may not represent something rare. It may represent something poorly intersected, something that exists outside our normal observational cadence, something that does not repeat on our timescales. That idea is uncomfortable because it implies that some phenomena cannot be studied through repetition. They can only be encountered once, briefly, without warning. That breaks a core assumption of how knowledge is built. But assumptions are not laws. They are conveniences. This event challenges that convenience. It suggests that some parts of reality do not care whether they are understood. They intersect, pass through, and leave. Not because they are hostile, but because they are indifferent. Indifference is harder to process than mystery. Mystery implies intent. Indifference implies scale. This event feels indifferent. It did not linger. It did not adapt. It did not respond. It behaved as if observation was irrelevant. That is not dramatic. It is quietly destabilizing, because it implies that significance is not proportional to observability. Important things may happen outside our ability to revisit them, not because they are hidden, but because they are not structured for repetition. This forces a reframing. Instead of asking how to reproduce the event, the more productive question becomes, what kind of phenomena only intersect once? What kinds of processes produce complete structures without recurrence? Those questions do not have answers yet, but they do narrow possibilities. They point away from randomness. They point away from noise. They point toward transient alignment, toward conditions briefly satisfied and then lost. That loss does not require catastrophe. It only requires change, slight shifts, marginal differences, enough to prevent recurrence. This event may have occurred at the boundary of several overlapping conditions, a boundary that no longer exists. Boundaries are thin, they do not persist. They move, which means events that depend on them are rare not in occurrence but in detectability. That distinction matters because it means the universe may be full of phenomena that happen constantly, but almost never intersect us in a way we can record. This event did, once. That makes it valuable, not as evidence, but as a hint that our sampling of reality is thinner than we assume, that our instruments are not wrong, but incomplete, and that completeness may be unattainable. This does not invalidate science. It contextualizes it. Science is excellent at studying stable, repeatable systems. It struggles with transient, boundary-dependent ones. This event belongs to the second category, and categories like that are always discovered late. After assumptions harden, after confidence grows, they arrive as disruptions. Not dramatic disruptions, quiet ones. This event did not shout. It whispered, and then it left. That whisper is easy to ignore, but ignoring it has consequences. Because if this represents the first visible instance of a broader class, then treating it as meaningless delays recognition, not forever, but long enough to miss more. That is why events like this are often recognized in hindsight, years later, when new data arrives, when frameworks shift, when language changes. Suddenly, the old anomaly makes sense, not because it changed, but because everything else did. This event is waiting for that moment. Not actively, not intentionally, just structurally. It remains unchanged while understanding moves around it. That is how the most disruptive discoveries begin, not as breakthroughs, but as unresolved references. What ultimately makes events like this so difficult to accept is not that they are unexplained. It's that they suggest explanation itself may be optional. We like to believe that observation naturally leads to understanding, that if something is recorded clearly enough, long enough, it will eventually yield meaning. That belief is comforting. It implies a universe that waits patiently for us to catch up. But events like this challenge that assumption. They suggest that some phenomena do not exist for explanation. They exist regardless of whether explanation is possible. And that is a far more unsettling idea because it reframes ignorance. Ignorance is no longer a temporary state. It becomes a permanent feature, not because we failed, but because the system we are observing does not guarantee accessibility. This event did not fail to repeat. It simply did not repeat for us. That distinction matters, because repetition is not an inherent property of phenomena. It is an interaction between phenomena and observation. If the interaction does not recur, neither does the data. We often forget that. We speak as if events repeat independently of us, as if the universe is performing experiments for our benefit. It isn't. We intersect with processes already in motion. Sometimes we intersect twice, sometimes once, sometimes never. This event was a single intersection, and that alone may explain everything about it. Not its origin, not its nature, but its silence. The silence is not mysterious. It is indifferent. Indifference is harder to process than hostility. Hostility implies intent. Indifference implies scale. This event behaved as if observation was irrelevant to it, as if detection neither altered nor influenced its existence. It passed through our instruments the way countless other processes pass through space, most of them unnoticed, most of them unrecorded. This one was recorded by chance. That chance is easy to underestimate. We tend to believe that significant things will make themselves obvious. That belief is a bias. Significance is not correlated with visibility. Some of the most consequential processes in nature operate quietly, peripherally, outside attention. This event may belong to that category, not because it was important, but because it was real. And reality does not prioritize our attention. Another uncomfortable implication follows. If noticing this event was accidental, then missing others is inevitable, not because of negligence, but because of scale. Our observational bandwidth is narrow. We sample slivers of reality, thin slices in time, thin slices in range, thin slices in condition. Anything that falls outside those slices simply passes by. That does not make it rare. It makes it inaccessible. This event slipped into one of those slices briefly, just long enough to be recorded, and then it was gone. No warning, no transition. This challenges a deeply held assumption. The assumption that if something matters, we will see it again. That assumption is not supported by evidence. It is supported by habit. Most things we study are chosen precisely because they repeat. We build methods around repetition. We design instruments for persistence. We optimize for stability, which means we are poorly equipped to handle transients, especially transients that do not announce themselves. This event did not announce itself. It did not violate expectations strongly enough to trigger alarms. It did not behave erratically enough to demand explanation. It behaved correctly enough to pass through systems designed to ignore anything that looks ordinary. That irony matters, because it means that some of the most informative events may be filtered out precisely because they behave well. They do not break rules. They follow them briefly, and then they leave. That creates a blind spot where coherence is mistaken for insignificance. This event survived that blind spot by chance, not because it was obvious, but because someone paused. That pause is fragile. It cannot be systematized easily. It depends on attention, on timing, on context, which means recognition is not guaranteed. That realization shifts responsibility, not toward better instruments, but toward better humility. It suggests that our picture of reality is incomplete, not because of missing data, but because of missing encounters. Encounters cannot be forced. They can only be noticed. This event was noticed once. That does not make it special. It makes it representative of a vast class of phenomena that intersect observation rarely, if ever. That class does not announce itself. It does not cluster. It does not repeat reliably. It exists at the margins. Margins are where frameworks fail, not dramatically, quietly. This is why events like this often linger unresolved, not because they are complex, but because they do not conform to the assumptions required for explanation. They are not puzzles. They are reminders. Reminders that reality is not obligated to be legible, that meaning is not guaranteed by detection, that understanding is not a right. It is an outcome of alignment between observer and observed. This event represented a moment of alignment, brief, accidental, unrepeatable. That does not make it frustrating. It makes it honest, because it reveals something about how knowledge actually forms, not linearly, not comprehensively, but opportunistically. We learn what intersects us often enough to study. Everything else passes by. That does not diminish its existence. It only limits our access. This event is a marker of that limit, a single data point that refuses to become more, not because it hides, but because it does not return. And that may be the most important lesson it offers, not about what exists, but about how little we are guaranteed to see. If this event had never been recorded, nothing would be missing from our models. No prediction would fail. No calculation would break. Reality would continue exactly as before. The only difference would be awareness. And awareness is not required for reality to function. That is difficult to accept, because we prefer to believe that understanding is inevitable, that given enough time, everything becomes clear. This event suggests otherwise. It suggests that some things may only ever be known as having happened once, without explanation, without continuation, without resolution. And that may not be a flaw. It may be a feature of a universe too large, too layered, too transient to be fully sampled. This event does not demand belief. It does not demand interpretation. It only demands acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that detection is not destiny. That observation does not imply repetition. That meaning is not guaranteed. And that sometimes the most honest answer is not, "We don't know yet," but "We may never." And that is where Section 1 ends. Not with a conclusion, but with a boundary. A clear line between what can be studied and what can only be encountered. What follows next is not about explaining this event. It is about understanding why events like this are almost always noticed too late, if they are noticed at all, and what that says about how much of reality never becomes data. Most events that are noticed only once are not rare because they occur infrequently. They are rare because they are difficult to intersect. This distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. We tend to think of rarity as scarcity, as something that happens almost never. But many phenomena happen constantly. They simply do not happen where or when we are looking. Observation is not continuous. It is selective. We look at specific ranges during specific windows under specific assumptions. Anything that falls outside those constraints might as well not exist. This creates an illusion. The illusion that what we observe represents what is out there. It does not. It represents what intersects our methods. This event intersected them once. That intersection was not guaranteed. It was not inevitable. It was contingent. Small changes would have erased it entirely. A slightly different timing, a slightly different configuration, a slightly different threshold, and it would have passed unnoticed. That fragility is important because it means recognition was not the result of significance. It was the result of alignment. Alignment between a transient process and a narrow observational slice. That alignment lasted briefly, long enough to record, not long enough to study. This is the signature of many unseen phenomena. They are not hidden. They are misaligned. They exist outside the cadence of our observation. We design systems to monitor stability. We optimize for persistence. We expect phenomena to repeat, to linger, to announce themselves. Anything that does not behave this way is at a disadvantage. It slips through. This event slipped through almost entirely. The fact that it was noticed at all is unusual, and that suggests something uncomfortable. It suggests that many similar events may have passed through unnoticed, not because they were weaker, but because they were just as clean. Clean events are easier to ignore than chaotic ones. Chaos attracts attention. Order blends in. This event blended in until it was already gone. That is not accidental. Our filters are designed to remove the ordinary. They preserve anomalies by exception. This one sat precisely at the boundary. Ordinary enough to pass, anomalous enough to survive. That balance is rare, not in nature, in detection, which means this event may not be unique. It may simply be the only one that slipped through intact. This reframes the idea of once. Once does not necessarily mean singular. It means singularly noticed. That is a profound difference, because it implies that uniqueness may be an artifact of observation, not reality. We assume that if something happens only once in the data, it happened only once in existence. That assumption is unjustified. Data is not reality. It is a projection of reality through limited instruments. This event is a projection with no depth information. We see the shadow, not the object, and shadows can be misleading. Another reason these events are noticed late is expectation. Expectation is not neutral. It shapes perception. We do not look for what we do not expect to find. Even automated systems are built on expectation. Thresholds, filters, categories, all encode assumptions. Anything that violates assumptions strongly is flagged. Anything that violates them weakly is absorbed. This event violated assumptions weakly. That is why it survived. It did not scream. It whispered. And whispers are easy to miss. Expectation also influences interpretation. When something unfamiliar appears, the first instinct is to reduce it, to map it onto something known. This reduction is efficient. It prevents overload, but it also erases novelty. This event resisted reduction just enough to remain unresolved. That resistance kept it alive, but it also kept it isolated, because unresolved data is uncomfortable. It does not feed models. It does not generate predictions. It just sits there. Most systems are designed to minimize sitting. They move forward or discard. This event did neither. It remained suspended. That suspension delayed recognition, not because people were careless, but because there was nothing to do with it. No next step, no repetition, no comparison, just a record. Records without narratives tend to fade. They do not disappear. They simply stop being looked at until something changes. Usually, that change comes from elsewhere, a new framework, a new method, a new question. Then the old record becomes relevant again. This is why events like this are often recognized in hindsight, not when they occur, but when the surrounding understanding shifts. At that moment, the event feels prescient, as if it was waiting. In reality, it was just unresolved. Resolution requires context. Context arrives slowly. This event has not yet received enough context, which means it remains isolated. Isolation is not evidence of insignificance. It is evidence of mismatch. Mismatch between phenomenon and framework. That mismatch is the hallmark of unseen categories. Categories we do not yet have names for. Categories that cannot be studied directly. They reveal themselves only through brief intersections. Like this one. This creates a paradox. The more transient a phenomenon is, the harder it is to recognize. The harder it is to recognize, the less data we have. The less data we have, the harder it is to justify attention. And without attention, recognition is delayed further. This feedback loop favors stable phenomena. Transient ones are penalized. This event escaped that loop once, barely. That escape is fragile. It cannot be repeated on demand, which means we cannot rely on repetition to learn more. We must rely on inference. but inference without comparison is limited. This forces humility. It forces us to admit that some parts of reality are poorly sampled, not because we are incapable, but because sampling is constrained. This event sits at the edge of those constraints, not pushing against them violently, just touching them. That touch was enough to leave a trace, and traces matter. They are the only evidence of what lies beyond observation. This event is a trace, not of something dramatic, but of something misaligned. Misalignment is harder to detect than absence. Absence is obvious. Misalignment looks like normality. This is why these events are noticed late, not because they hide, but because they do not look like what we think we are looking for. Recognition requires contrast. This event lacked contrast until it was already gone. That is the pattern, and it suggests that many phenomena may only ever be recognized retrospectively, when absence becomes noticeable, when silence becomes conspicuous, when something that should have repeated did not. That non-repetition is the only signal. It is subtle. It does not announce itself. It requires patience. This event has waited, not actively, not intentionally. It has simply remained unresolved. And unresolved things exert pressure. They linger. They destabilize confidence quietly. They force frameworks to flex. That flexing is slow, but it is how progress happens, not through answers, through discomfort. This event is a source of discomfort, not because it is strange, but because it behaves as if it does not care whether it is understood. That indifference is the clearest sign that it belongs to a broader reality we barely intersect. The idea that large portions of reality exist outside our observational cadence is difficult to accept because it undermines a quiet assumption. The assumption that if something is real, it will eventually show itself. That assumption feels reasonable. It feels fair. But fairness is not a property of nature. Visibility is not guaranteed. Reality does not scale itself to observation. Observation scales itself to convenience. We build instruments around what we expect to find. We tune methods to phenomena that behave politely. Polite phenomena repeat. They persist. They stay long enough to be measured again. Anything that does not behave this way becomes expensive to notice. And expense discourages attention. This creates layers, not physical layers, observational layers. A thin surface layer of reality that repeats, stabilizes, and conforms. And beneath it, deeper layers that intersect rarely, briefly, or not at all. We are fluent in the surface layer. It is where models work. It is where predictions succeed. But fluency creates blindness. We begin to assume that the surface is representative. It isn't. It is survivorship. What we see is what survives our methods. This event survived once. That survival does not make it special. It makes it visible, which implies that countless others were not. This is where the idea of missing data becomes misleading. Missing data implies absence, but absence implies expectation. You can only miss what you expect to be there. What if most of what exists was never expected? Then it isn't missing. It's simply outside the frame. Frames matter. They define what counts as signal and what counts as noise. Noise is not meaningless. Noise is unmodeled structure. We treat it as disposable because modeling everything is impossible. So we prioritize. Those priorities harden. Over time, they become invisible. This event slipped through because it aligned just enough with priority, not because it demanded attention, but because it avoided deletion. Avoidance is not the same as recognition. Recognition requires comparison. Comparison requires repetition. This event offered neither, which means recognition stalled. This leads to a quiet consequence. We tend to believe that what we study is what matters, but what we study is what stays. Staying is not a measure of importance. It is a measure of compatibility with observation. Transient phenomena are punished. Boundary phenomena are punished. Anything that exists only briefly or conditionally is filtered out, not intentionally, systematically. This event represents a rare failure of that system. a single moment where something outside the surface layer intersected our frame, just enough to be recorded, not enough to be understood. That partial intersection is revealing because it suggests that the deeper layers are not empty, they are simply inaccessible. Accessibility is not binary, it is probabilistic. Most of the time, probability favors the surface. Occasionally, it doesn't. Those occasions are easy to miss because they don't announce themselves. They don't violate rules strongly enough. They follow rules briefly, and then they leave. This creates a dangerous illusion, the illusion that everything important has already been found, that what remains is refinement. This illusion is comfortable. It allows confidence. But confidence without completeness is fragile. Events like this expose that fragility, not by breaking models, but by refusing to enter them. There's another reason deeper layers remain unseen: time. Our observations are temporally shallow. We sample moments. We rarely sample processes. Processes that unfold over long durations may intersect us only once. Processes that unfold over short durations may pass too quickly. Both are disadvantaged. This event may belong to either category, or both. It may be a moment in a process too slow or too fast for our cadence. We intersected it at exactly one point. That intersection is all we have. Without knowing the process, the moment is meaningless. Without the moment, the process is invisible. This asymmetry is important because it means understanding depends on alignment in time as much as alignment in structure. We often assume that time is abundant, that given enough time, we will eventually see repetition. But time is not abundant in observation. It is discretized. We observe when we can. We observe what we can. Everything else happens unobserved. This event happened to coincide once. That coincidence is not magical. It is statistical. Given enough processes and enough time, intersections occur. Most are missed. This one wasn't. But one is not enough. One does not create confidence. It creates discomfort. That discomfort is useful. It forces a reconsideration of what we think is observable. It forces a reevaluation of what we think is rare. Rarity may not describe occurrence. It may describe detection. This distinction has consequences. It means that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence in a much more literal sense than we usually admit. It means that entire classes of phenomena may exist without leaving stable traces. They may not accumulate evidence. They may not cluster. They may not become obvious. They may simply intersect occasionally. This makes them almost impossible to study traditionally, but not impossible to acknowledge. Acknowledgement is the first step. This event demands acknowledgement, not because it points somewhere, but because it points outward, away from certainty, away from completeness, toward humility. Humility is not resignation. It is accuracy. It is an honest assessment of reach. This event defines a limit, not a dramatic limit, a quiet one, a limit where observation ends and inference begins. Most of science lives comfortably before that limit. This event sits just beyond it, which is why it remains unresolved. Not because we lack intelligence, but because we lack access. Access is not something that can always be engineered. Sometimes it is simply granted briefly. This event was a brief grant. It did not promise continuation. It did not promise explanation. It simply occurred, and then it was gone. That may be all some phenomena ever offer. If that is true, then our picture of reality is necessarily incomplete, not temporarily, permanently. That does not weaken knowledge. It defines it. Knowledge becomes not a complete map, but a partial one, a map of intersections, not of totality. This event is a marker on that map, a single point where deeper layers brushed against the surface, and then retreated. We may never see another, or we may have already seen many and failed to notice. Either possibility is equally unsettling, because both imply that much of reality does not wait for recognition. It moves independently. Occasionally, it crosses our path, and when it does, it leaves a trace, not always meaningful. not always interpretable, but real. This event is such a trace. And traces accumulate meaning not through explanation, but through context. Context has not arrived yet, which means this trace remains raw, unassimilated, waiting. Even when traces like this are recorded, they face another obstacle that is rarely acknowledged. They must survive memory, not human memory, system memory. Systems are not designed to remember everything. They are designed to forget efficiently. Forgetting is not a flaw, it is a requirement. Without forgetting, systems collapse under weight, so they prioritize. They decide, implicitly, what is worth keeping active and what can be pushed aside. This prioritization is not malicious, it is structural. Anything that does not generate follow-up is deprioritized. Anything that does not connect to other data is weakened. Anything that cannot be acted on loses relevance. This is how forgetting happens, quietly. This event did not fail because it was erased. It failed because it did not propagate. It did not generate descendants. Most remembered data survives because it creates more data. Repetition creates lineage. Lineage creates relevance. This event created none. No sequence, no cluster, no progression. It existed, and then it stopped. Systems struggle with that, because systems are optimized for continuity. They expect that meaningful things continue. When something ends cleanly, with no aftermath, it feels complete. Completion signals closure. Closure signals irrelevance. This is a dangerous shortcut. Completion does not imply insignificance, but systems treat it that way. This is why transient events are forgotten more easily than persistent ones. Persistence demands attention. Transience suggests resolution. This event appeared resolved, not explained, but finished. That finish made it easy to shelve. Shelving is not deletion, but it is a step toward obscurity. Over time, shelved data loses context. Context is not static. It decays as frameworks evolve. What once seemed unusual becomes harder to recognize as such, because the surrounding language changes. The questions change. The priorities change. This is another form of forgetting, not loss of data, loss of relevance. This event survived as data, but not as focus. Focus moved elsewhere, toward things that repeated, toward things that promised payoff. That shift is rational. Resources are finite, but it has consequences. It biases understanding toward what persists. It trains us to equate importance with longevity. This is a mistake. Some of the most consequential processes in nature are brief. They do not linger. They do not repeat conveniently. They alter conditions and then vanish. But those processes often reveal themselves only indirectly, through aftermath. This event had no aftermath. That absence made it harder to justify attention, because aftermath is how we infer significance. Without it, the event feels isolated. Isolation discourages investment. This creates a feedback loop. Events that do not generate aftermath are ignored. Ignored events do not generate further study. Without study, no aftermath is found. The loop closes. This event is caught inside that loop, not because it is unimportant, but because it is self-contained. Self-contained phenomena are difficult to study. They do not invite iteration. They do not offer leverage. They simply exist, and existence alone is rarely enough. Another factor accelerates forgetting: normality. This event did not look extraordinary. It did not violate expectations violently. It followed rules. Rules are comforting. They signal familiarity. When something follows rules, we assume it belongs. Belonging reduces urgency. Urgency drives memory. This event lacked urgency. It did not demand explanation. It did not threaten models. It quietly resisted integration. Quiet resistance is easy to overlook because it does not create friction. It creates ambiguity. Ambiguity is tolerated, often indefinitely. This is why systems forget unresolved things faster than resolved ones. Resolution creates closure. Unresolved ambiguity creates fatigue. Fatigue leads to avoidance. Avoidance leads to neglect. Neglect leads to obscurity. This event sits at the beginning of that chain, not erased, but faded. This fading is not a failure. It is predictable. But predictability does not make it harmless, because forgetting shapes understanding. What we remember defines what we think is possible. What we forget defines what we think is rare. If events like this fade, the picture of reality becomes biased. Biased toward stability, biased toward repetition, biased toward persistence. This bias is subtle. It does not appear as error. It appears as completeness. We begin to believe that the surface layer is the whole, that everything important either repeats or leaves traces. This belief is reinforced by success. Most phenomena we study behave this way, that success hides the exceptions. This event is an exception, not dramatic enough to force revision, not trivial enough to discard. It occupies a narrow middle ground. Middle ground is dangerous. It is where things disappear, not because they are removed, but because they are neither embraced nor rejected. They simply wait. Waiting is passive, but it is not neutral. While something waits, the world changes around it. Frameworks evolve. Language shifts. Eventually, the waiting thing no longer fits even its original context. At that point, it becomes difficult to retrieve meaning from it. This is how forgetting completes, not through deletion, through drift. This event has not reached that point yet, but it is moving toward it, unless something intervenes. Intervention does not require explanation. It requires attention. Attention is the only force that counteracts forgetting, but attention is scarce. It must be justified. This event does not justify itself easily. It does not promise answers. It does not lead anywhere obvious. It only sits there, unresolved. That makes it easy to postpone, and postponement is the enemy of memory. There is another bias at work, success bias. We remember what leads to success. Discoveries that generate further discoveries are celebrated. They are taught. They are referenced. Events that lead nowhere are quietly archived. This event has led nowhere, not because it is meaningless, but because it does not fit into a chain. Chains are how knowledge advances. This event is a link without a chain. That makes it inconvenient. Inconvenience is not fatal, but it is corrosive. Over time, inconvenient data is treated as background, not foreground. Foreground is where narratives form. This event has no narrative. Narrative is how memory persists. Without narrative, memory decays. This is why stories matter. They bind data together. This event resists story. It has no beginning beyond itself, no continuation, no end beyond disappearance. It is structurally unstory-like. That makes it fragile, not as data, as remembered significance. This fragility explains why such events are often rediscovered years later, when someone notices them again, not because they changed, but because someone new encountered them without old expectations. Fresh eyes sometimes see what systems forget, but rediscovery is not guaranteed. It requires coincidence. It requires curiosity. It requires patience. None of those are scalable, which means many such events remain forgotten, not erased, just dormant. This event may already be dormant, known but not active, acknowledged but not engaged. Dormancy is not resolution. It is postponement. Postponement accumulates cost. The longer something is postponed, the harder it is to revive. Context decays. Expertise disperses. Interest shifts. This is how data dies without being deleted. This event is still alive. Barely. It persists as an unresolved reference. That persistence is fragile, which raises a final, uncomfortable thought. How many similar events never even reached this stage? How many were filtered out before recording? How many were recorded and then lost to forgetting faster than this one? This event may not be unique. It may simply be one of the few that survived long enough to be noticed at all. That survival is not a sign of importance. It is a sign of luck. Luck in timing, luck in attention, luck in alignment. Understanding that changes how we should treat it, not as a mystery to solve, but as a reminder of how much is lost without ever being known. Systems tend to believe they have seen everything worth seeing, not because they are arrogant, but because they are efficient. Efficiency requires confidence. Confidence requires closure. And closure is easiest when the unknown is treated as exhausted. Over time, this creates a quiet assumption that what remains unseen is either insignificant or non-existent. This assumption is rarely stated. It is embedded. Embedded in thresholds, embedded in filters, embedded in funding decisions, embedded in what is revisited and what is not. Once an area of observation stops producing new results, it is labeled complete. Completion does not mean total understanding. It means diminishing returns, and diminishing returns signal redirection. Attention moves on. This is rational, but it creates a distortion because some phenomena do not produce returns at all until they suddenly do. This event belongs to that category. It produced no returns, no follow-up, no cascade of insight, no reinforcement. From a system perspective, it looked finished, and finished things are rarely revisited. The belief that we've already seen what's there is not born from certainty. It is born from exhaustion. After enough time passes without new information, silence is interpreted as absence, but silence is ambiguous. Silence may mean nothing is there, or it may mean nothing aligns. Systems are not good at distinguishing between the two. They treat both the same. That equivalence is dangerous, because alignment is conditional. Conditions change. What does not align today may align tomorrow. But if the system has already decided the space is empty, it will not be watching when alignment returns. This is how blind spots persist, not because of ignorance, but because of confidence. Confidence that nothing new remains. This confidence is reinforced by success. Most of the time, it is correct. Most spaces truly are exhausted, but the few that are not become invisible. This event sits in one of those spaces, a space labeled complete, not explicitly, implicitly. No alarms remain, no alerts trigger, no attention lingers. The system believes it has moved on for good reason. That belief is the final barrier. Even if something similar happens again, recognition is not guaranteed, because recognition depends on memory, and memory depends on relevance. This event has lost relevance, not because it was resolved, but because it did not produce continuation. This is the deepest bias. We equate continuation with importance. We equate silence with irrelevance. This equation works most of the time, but it fails catastrophically for transient phenomena. Transient phenomena do not reward persistence. They reward presence. You must be there when they pass. If you miss them, they leave no trace. If you record them once, they do not guarantee return. This makes them incompatible with systems built on accumulation. Systems prefer things that stay. This event did not stay, so it became a boundary case. Boundary cases are uncomfortable. They do not confirm rules. They do not break them. They simply exist at the edge. Edges are where understanding frays. But edges are also where expansion begins, only if they are noticed. The problem is that edges look empty from a distance. They do not signal richness. They signal silence. So systems turn away. That turning away feels justified. Nothing is happening, except that something already did, once. That once is easy to discount, because once is not a pattern, but every pattern begins with once. This is the contradiction. We require patterns to assign meaning, but patterns cannot form unless first instances are preserved. This event is a preserved first instance. Barely. It survived long enough to remain unresolved. But unresolved does not mean active. It is dormant. Dormant knowledge does not influence behavior. It does not shape models. It does not alter expectations, which means the system behaves as if it does not exist. This is how unseen categories remain unseen, not because they never intersect us, but because their intersections are treated as complete in isolation. This event was treated as complete. It happened. It ended. Nothing followed. From a system perspective, that is closure. From a reality perspective, it may not be. That mismatch is subtle, but it has consequences. It means that the system is biased toward believing that its view is comprehensive, not because it wants to be right, but because it cannot operate otherwise. Operating under permanent uncertainty is impossible. So uncertainty is compartmentalized. This event is inside that compartment, acknowledged, isolated, inactive. The danger is not that it remains unexplained. The danger is that it becomes invisible. Invisible not in data, invisible in consideration. When something becomes invisible, it cannot challenge assumptions. It cannot trigger revision. It cannot shape inquiry. It might as well not exist. This is the final stage of forgetting, not loss, irrelevance. This event is close to that stage, which raises a final, uncomfortable possibility. If systems are biased toward believing they have seen everything worth seeing, then unseen phenomena are not rare. They are inevitable. Not because reality is hiding things, but because observation is selective. We see what fits. We remember what continues. We forget what ends cleanly. This creates a filtered reality, a reality optimized for stability. But reality itself is not optimized. It is layered. Some layers intersect us constantly, others barely touch. This event touched once. That does not make it anomalous. It makes it marginal. Marginal phenomena are the hardest to recognize. They do not accumulate evidence. They do not shout. They do not return. They simply pass. If that is true, then the most incomplete part of our understanding is not what we don't know yet. It is what we have already seen, but stopped looking at. This event is a reminder of that, not because it points to something specific, but because it exposes a structural blind spot, a blind spot created not by ignorance, but by success. Success at explaining what repeats, success at modeling what persists. That success narrows focus, and narrowing focus inevitably excludes something. This event lives in that exclusion. It exists as proof that exclusion happens, not maliciously, systematically, which means it will happen again and again. Some events will be noticed, most will not. Those that are noticed may not be remembered. Those that are remembered may not be revisited. This is not failure, it is limitation. Understanding that limitation is the real value of this event. Not its content, its position. It sits at the edge of what systems are designed to handle. And edges are where assumptions weaken. That weakening is quiet, but it accumulates. In the next section, we move away from systems entirely. We turn to the observer, not what was recorded, but what it takes to notice something that only happens once, and why noticing may depend less on technology and more on attention. Noticing something that happens only once is not a matter of intelligence. It is a matter of position. Position in time, position in attention, position within expectation. Most observation is not discovery-driven. It is confirmation-driven. We look to verify what we already suspect exists. This is efficient. It allows progress, but it creates a blind spot. Anything that does not resemble an expected pattern is less likely to be noticed, even if it is recorded. This is the first barrier. Recording does not equal noticing. Data can exist without recognition. Recognition requires contrast. Contrast requires expectation. If something does not contrast strongly enough with expectation, it blends in. This event blended in. Not perfectly, but enough. The observer did not see something extraordinary. They saw something slightly off. Slightly off is easy to postpone, because slightly off happens constantly. Most of it resolves. This one didn't. But that was not immediately obvious. Time plays a role here. Events that happen once do not announce their uniqueness until later. At the moment of occurrence, they look ordinary. Their significance exists only in retrospect. This creates a paradox. You cannot recognize a one-time event as unique until time has passed. By then, the moment is gone. All that remains is data. And data without urgency is easy to ignore. Noticing, then, is often accidental. It happens when someone looks without a goal, when attention is not narrowly focused, when curiosity overrides efficiency. Those moments are rare. They cannot be scheduled. They cannot be automated easily. Most systems are designed to minimize them, which means noticing one-time events is structurally discouraged. This is not a flaw, it is a trade-off. You cannot notice everything, so you optimize, and optimization always excludes. This event was noticed because optimization failed briefly, not dramatically, subtly. Someone hesitated. Someone did not immediately discard what looked almost normal. That hesitation matters, because without it, this event would not exist in discussion at all. It would be gone, not erased, unrecognized. This raises an uncomfortable point. Noticing rare events may depend more on individual behavior than on system design. That makes it fragile. Individual attention is inconsistent. It depends on fatigue, on curiosity, on context. You cannot rely on it, which means that many one-time events are missed, not because they are hidden, but because no one pauses. Pausing is costly. It slows processes. It delays throughput. Efficiency discourages it. This creates a conflict. The more efficient a system becomes, the less likely it is to notice anomalies that do not break rules loudly. This event did not break rules loudly. It followed them. Following rules makes things invisible. Rules define normality. Anything within normality is treated as expected. Expected things do not attract attention. This is why noticing is often linked to anomaly in behavior, not anomaly in structure. Chaotic events stand out. Clean ones blend in. This event was clean. That cleanliness was its camouflage. It did not demand attention. It did not force intervention. It allowed itself to be overlooked, not intentionally, structurally. Another factor shapes noticing: trust. Observers trust systems. If a system does not flag something, it is assumed to be fine. This trust is necessary. Without it, every output would require scrutiny. That is impossible. But trust has consequences. It means that anything not flagged must be extraordinary to be noticed. This event was not extraordinary enough. It survived because it was reviewed manually later, not because the system demanded it. Manual review is rare. It is usually triggered by expectation. This one was not expected. It was found incidentally. Incidental discovery is unpredictable. It cannot be engineered reliably. This means that one-time events rely on chance for recognition. Chance is not a robust strategy, which implies that many such events go unnoticed permanently. This is not speculation. It is structural. The more data you collect, the more aggressive filtering must become. The more aggressive filtering becomes, the fewer subtle anomalies survive. Subtle anomalies are precisely the ones that may represent new categories. This creates a paradox. The better we get at collecting data, the worse we become at noticing certain kinds of novelty. This event survived early data volumes. It may not survive later ones. That matters, because it suggests that early observation eras may be richer in unnoticed anomalies than later ones. Not because reality changed, but because filtering intensified. This event may be a relic of that earlier window, a time when systems were less optimized, less confident, more permissive. That permissiveness allowed marginal things to persist. As optimization increases, permissiveness decreases. Marginal things are lost. This does not show up as error. It shows up as cleanliness, cleaner data, fewer anomalies. That cleanliness is deceptive. It suggests completeness, but it may reflect exclusion of phenomena that do not repeat cleanly. This event sits at the threshold of that exclusion, barely inside memory, barely outside noise. That precarious position is why it still matters, not because it is mysterious, but because it reveals a process by which reality is filtered into knowledge. That process is not neutral. It favors certain kinds of events. This event was not favored. It survived by accident. Accidents are not sustainable, which means relying on them is risky. If noticing one-time events requires luck, then understanding such events is not guaranteed. That implies a limit not of intelligence, but of access. Access is shaped by design choices. Design choices reflect priorities. Priorities reflect goals. Most goals prioritize stability. This event does not reward stability. It rewards openness. Openness is inefficient, but it is the only way to notice certain things. This creates a tension. Do you optimize for what you know or for what you might encounter? You cannot do both equally. This event exposes the cost of choosing optimization. The cost is invisibility. Invisibility of entire classes of phenomena. This does not mean those phenomena are important. Importance is subjective. It means they exist. Existence without recognition is still existence. That idea is easy to accept abstractly. It is harder to accept operationally, because operations require decisions. Decisions require criteria. Criteria require exclusion. This event fell through those criteria once. Once is not enough to change systems, but it is enough to question them. And questioning is where understanding begins. Expectation does not end at noticing. It continues into interpretation. What we think we are seeing is shaped long before we decide what it means. The moment something is noticed, it is already being compared. Compared to past experiences. Compared to known categories. Compared to what feels reasonable. This comparison happens automatically. It is not a conscious choice. And that is where many one-time events are lost a second time. Not because they are unseen, but because they are misseen. Interpretation is a narrowing process. It reduces ambiguity. It forces unfamiliar inputs into familiar shapes. This is usually helpful. Without it, understanding would stall. But when something truly unfamiliar appears, interpretation becomes a filter. It does not ask, "What is this?" It asks, "What is this most like?" That question already assumes belonging. This event did not belong cleanly anywhere, but interpretation tried anyway. That effort softened it. Rough edges were smoothed. Unusual alignments were downplayed. Ambiguity was reframed as imperfection. This is not deception. It is efficiency. The mind prefers coherence. When coherence is missing, it manufactures it. This is how anomalies dissolve, not through dismissal, through normalization. This event resisted normalization, but only partially. It resisted enough to remain unresolved, but not enough to force a new category. That left it suspended. Suspension is not neutral. It invites reinterpretation. Each reinterpretation slightly reshapes memory. Over time, the original strangeness fades. What remains is a simplified version, less sharp, less demanding. This is how one-time events lose their disruptive power, not all at once, gradually. Another expectation-driven distortion appears here. We assume that meaningful events are interpretable. If something resists interpretation, we assume the problem is with the data, or with the method, rarely with the framework. Frameworks are expensive to question. They represent accumulated success. This success creates inertia. It discourages revision. So interpretation bends the event instead. It bends until it fits, or until it breaks. This event did not break. It bent just enough to stay intact. But bending has consequences. It shifts emphasis. Some features become central. Others become peripheral. Over time, what was originally striking becomes background. What remains is an outline without urgency. This is how interpretation becomes forgetting. Not forgetting the event, forgetting its implications. This event's implication was not what it was. It was that it resisted being categorized. Interpretation tried to fix that by categorizing parts of it. Partial categorization feels satisfying. It gives the illusion of progress. But partial categorization can be more dangerous than none because it creates false closure. False closure is harder to undo than open questions. An open question invites attention. A closed but wrong answer repels it. This event was never fully closed, but parts of it were. Those partial closures weakened curiosity. They reduced the perceived need to revisit. This is how one-time events fade from active consideration, not because they are solved, but because they are softened. Expectation also shapes what explanations feel acceptable. Some explanations feel too disruptive. They imply too much change. Others feel safe. They fit comfortably within existing models. When forced to choose, interpretation gravitates towards safety. This event did not force a choice. It allowed safe interpretations to coexist with uncertainty. That coexistence reduced tension. Reduced tension reduces urgency. Urgency drives inquiry. Without urgency, inquiry slows. This is another structural bias. Events that demand explanation loudly are prioritized. Events that whisper are postponed. This one whispered. That whisper was easy to rationalize, easy to contextualize away. But whispers can be important. They often indicate thresholds. Thresholds between categories. Thresholds are not dramatic. They are subtle. They feel like ambiguity. This event sits on a threshold. Interpretation does not like thresholds. It prefers clear sides. So it nudges the event onto one side. Not fully, just enough to stop discomfort. This is why expectation is so powerful. It does not erase anomalies. It dulls them. It makes them tolerable. Tolerable anomalies do not drive change. They become curiosities, footnotes, references. This event risks becoming that, a reference without force. Another expectation enters here. We expect that if something truly challenges understanding, it will do so repeatedly. That expectation is rarely questioned, but it may be wrong. Some challenges occur once, not because they are rare, but because they are poorly aligned. If alignment never recurs, neither does challenge. This event may represent such a challenge, but because it occurred only once, interpretation treats it as insufficient. Insufficient to warrant revision. Insufficient to justify disruption. This sets a high bar. A bar that transient phenomena cannot clear. This is another bias. We equate frequency with importance. What happens often feels important. What happens once feels incidental. This is a cognitive shortcut. It is usually useful, but it fails for boundary phenomena. Boundary phenomena do not repeat reliably. They appear at transitions. Transitions are brief. They do not linger. They are easy to miss. When they are noticed, they are often misinterpreted as noise. This event avoided being labeled noise, but it did not escape being labeled minor. Minor events are tolerated. They do not demand action. This is how interpretation neutralizes novelty, not by denying it, by shrinking it. Over time, the original discomfort fades. What remains is a manageable oddity. Manageable oddities do not change frameworks. They decorate them. This event deserves more than decoration, not because of what it was, but because of how it behaved. It behaved as if it did not care how it was interpreted. Interpretation did not alter it. It remained unresolved. That stubbornness is important. It means that despite all efforts to soften it, something remains, a residue, a sense that it does not belong. That residue is the true signal, not the event itself, but the discomfort that persists after interpretation. That discomfort is easy to ignore, but it accumulates across events, across time. Each unresolved residue weakens confidence slightly. Eventually, confidence cracks, not from one event, from many. This event may be one of those cracks. Small, quiet, but real. Cracks do not change understanding immediately. They weaken it slowly. At first, they are dismissed as imperfections, minor inconsistencies, edge cases that do not justify attention. Each one feels manageable. Individually, they do not threaten anything, but they accumulate. And accumulation changes structure. Understanding is not overturned by single events. It erodes. Confidence does not collapse. It thins. This is how shifts actually happen, not through revelation, through discomfort that refuses to disappear. Each unresolved event leaves behind a small remainder, not data, doubt. Doubt is not uncertainty about facts. It is uncertainty about completeness. This event left doubt, not enough to force revision, enough to linger. When many such doubts coexist, frameworks begin to feel strained, not broken, tight. They require more exceptions, more caveats, more footnotes. Footnotes are where cracks hide. They allow the main structure to remain intact, but footnotes accumulate. Eventually, the structure becomes heavy with them. At that point, change becomes attractive, not because something new was discovered, but because maintaining the old becomes inefficient. This event is a footnote, one of many. It does not stand out alone, but it contributes. Over time, patterns emerge, not in the events themselves, but in the discomfort they produce. Different events, different contexts, same feeling, a sense that something does not fit. This feeling is rarely articulated. It is not formalized. It lives in hesitation, in phrases like, "that's odd," or "that's interesting," that go nowhere. Those phrases are markers. They signal pressure. This event generated such pressure. It did not explode. It did not demand response. It simply resisted closure. Resistance is not dramatic. It is persistent. Persistence is powerful because it outlasts explanation. You can explain around an event. You can contextualize it. You can minimize it. But if it does not resolve, it remains. That remaining presence exerts force, slowly, across time. This is how categories shift, not because someone decides to change them, but because they stop working comfortably. The first sign of that discomfort is fatigue. Fatigue with exceptions. Fatigue with special cases. Fatigue with explanations that feel increasingly artificial. This fatigue is quiet. It does not announce itself, but it spreads. As fatigue spreads, openness increases. People become willing to consider alternatives, not radical ones, just slightly broader ones. This is where new categories begin, not as revolutions, as adjustments. This event does not define a new category. It is too small, too isolated, but it contributes to the pressure that makes new categories possible. This is its value, not its content, its persistence. Another important aspect of accumulation is memory, not institutional memory, cognitive memory. Events like this are remembered vaguely, not in detail, but in impression. A sense that something like this has happened before. That sense matters. It shapes how future anomalies are treated. When a new event appears that resembles an old unresolved one, even loosely, hesitation increases. Immediate dismissal feels riskier. This event may influence such hesitation, not directly, indirectly, through pattern recognition. Pattern recognition does not require repetition of identical events. It requires resonance. This event resonates, not strongly, but enough. That resonance may protect future events from being erased. This is how progress happens invisibly. One unresolved event slightly increases tolerance. Another does the same. Eventually, tolerance shifts. What was once ignored becomes interesting. What was once dismissed becomes questionable. This event is part of that shift. It does not lead. It supports. Support roles are invisible, but they are necessary. Leading events get credit. Supporting events make leadership possible. This is another reason one-time events matter. Not because they explain anything, but because they soften certainty. Softened certainty is fertile. It allows exploration. Without softened certainty, exploration feels reckless. This event softens certainty, just a little. Another important factor is language. Language shapes thought. When enough unresolved events accumulate, language adapts. New terms emerge, not official ones, informal ones. Words like edge case, anomaly, outlier. These words are placeholders. They acknowledge difference without explaining it. This event lives inside such language. Language is a precursor to categorization. Before something is understood, it is named vaguely. This event has a vague name. That matters. It keeps it accessible, even if not understood. Accessibility preserves possibility. Possibility is what allows future reinterpretation. This event remains possible. It has not been closed. That openness is fragile, but it exists. Cracks also influence humility. When enough unresolved events exist, confidence becomes conditional. People become more cautious about absolute claims. This caution is healthy. It prevents overreach. This event contributes to that caution, not loudly, but quietly. Quiet influence is hard to measure, but it is real. This is why one-time events should not be evaluated solely on explanatory power. They should be evaluated on structural impact. This event's structural impact is small, but non-zero. It sits in the background, exerting pressure. That pressure accumulates. Eventually, something gives. Not necessarily here, elsewhere, in another context, triggered by another event, but influenced by this one. This is how change propagates. Indirectly, across contexts, across time. This event is not waiting to be explained. It is waiting to be joined by others. Similar not in content, but in behavior. Events that occur once. Events that resist repetition. Events that do not collapse into categories. When enough of these exist, something shifts. Not because they form a pattern, but because they form a problem that cannot be ignored. This event is one data point in that problem. Alone, it is manageable. With others, it becomes disruptive. We do not know how many others exist. We may never know, because many were likely missed. This event may represent the visible edge of an invisible set. That possibility alone is significant. It suggests that what we see is not representative. That understanding is biased toward what stays. This bias is rarely corrected explicitly. It is corrected implicitly, through discomfort, through accumulation, through cracks. This event is a crack, not a fracture, but cracks are how structures fail or evolve. Failure and evolution look similar from inside. Both involve instability. Instability is not chaos. It is potential. This event contributes to potential. Potential for reconsideration. Potential for humility. Potential for expansion. It does not demand that expansion. It allows it. Thresholds are almost never visible while they are forming. They are only obvious after they are crossed. This is one of the most misleading aspects of change. We imagine thresholds as clear lines, defined moments, points where something switches from one state to another. In reality, thresholds are gradients. They build invisibly. By the time they are recognized, the transition has already occurred. This is why people are often surprised by shifts that feel sudden. They weren't sudden, they were silent. This event is part of such a silent buildup, not because it changed anything directly, but because it contributed weight. Thresholds are crossed not by single events, but by accumulation. Each unresolved anomaly adds mass, not enough to matter on its own, enough to matter together. The problem is that accumulation does not feel like progress. It feels like clutter. Unresolved things are uncomfortable. They create cognitive friction. So there is pressure to resolve them or to ignore them. Ignoring them is easier. That is how thresholds are delayed. But delayed is not prevented. Eventually, the number of unresolved elements becomes too large to ignore. At that point, something changes. Not suddenly, but decisively. This event will not be remembered as the moment something changed. It will be remembered, if at all, as something that makes sense now. That phrase is revealing. Now implies context. Context is what thresholds create. Before a threshold, events feel isolated. After a threshold, they feel connected. The events themselves do not change. The framework around them does. This is why early anomalies often feel trivial. They are missing the environment that would make them meaningful. Meaning is relational. It depends on what else exists. This event exists ahead of its meaning. That makes it uncomfortable. It demands patience. Patience is rare, but patience is the only thing that allows thresholds to be recognized rather than stumbled over. Another reason thresholds are invisible is because systems resist recognizing them. Recognizing a threshold implies that previous assumptions are no longer sufficient. That recognition threatens stability. So systems delay it. They reinterpret signals. They reframe discomfort. They normalize cracks. This delay can last a long time, sometimes indefinitely. Thresholds can be crossed without anyone noticing. The system simply behaves differently. People adapt. New language emerges. New practices appear. Old ones fade. Only later does anyone realize that something fundamental shifted. This event may be on the near side of such a shift, or it may be far. There is no way to tell. Thresholds do not announce distance. They only announce crossing. This is why one-time events are so easy to misjudge. They do not tell you where you are. They only tell you that something does not fit. This lack of orientation is unsettling. It invites either overreaction or dismissal. Most choose dismissal. Dismissal delays change, but it does not stop it. The accumulation continues. Each unresolved event remains unresolved. Each contributes quietly. Eventually, the cost of maintaining the old framework exceeds the cost of changing it. That is the moment of crossing. But that moment is rarely dramatic. It feels like relief. Relief from maintaining exceptions. Relief from explanations that no longer satisfy. This event contributes to that eventual relief, not by force, by presence. Presence without explanation is powerful. It refuses to cooperate. It waits. Waiting is not passive. It is pressure deferred. This event has been waiting, not intentionally, structurally. It exists without resolution. It occupies cognitive space. That occupation is costly. Even if the cost is small, small costs accumulate. This is how thresholds are crossed. Not by spikes, by drips. One drip is meaningless. 1,000 reshape stone. This event is a drip. It reshapes nothing alone, but it participates. Another important aspect of thresholds is hindsight. After crossing, earlier events are reinterpreted. They are seen as precursors, as warnings, as signals. This reinterpretation creates a narrative. Narratives simplify history. They make change seem inevitable. In reality, it was contingent. It depended on accumulation. It depended on survival of unresolved events. Many did not survive. This one did. That survival increases its chance of being reinterpreted later, not because it was important, but because it was available. Availability matters. History is written by what remains, not by what was most significant. This event remains. That gives it a chance. But chance is not destiny. It may still be forgotten. Thresholds do not guarantee reinterpretation. They only make it possible. Possibility is all this event offers. That may feel unsatisfying. We prefer conclusions, but conclusions are not always honest. Sometimes the most honest position is suspension. This event forces suspension. It cannot be closed. It cannot be expanded. It just is. This just is position is uncomfortable, but it is where real change incubates. When enough just is events exist, pressure builds. Pressure without direction. That pressure eventually finds an outlet, a new framework, a new category, a new way of seeing. When that happens, earlier events snap into place. They suddenly appear obvious. This creates the illusion of inevitability. It was not inevitable. It was fragile. It depended on events like this not being erased, not being forgotten, not being forced into explanations prematurely. This event survived without explanation. That survival is its contribution, not to knowledge, to readiness. Readiness for change, readiness to notice, readiness to question. That readiness cannot be forced. It can only be cultivated. Events like this cultivated indirectly. They teach patience. They teach restraint. They teach respect for the unknown. These lessons are rarely celebrated. They do not produce headlines, but they shape thinking. This event shaped thinking quietly. It created a small pocket of uncertainty. That pocket may one day connect with others, or it may remain isolated. Both outcomes are possible. Thresholds are probabilistic, not guaranteed. This event increases probability, nothing more, nothing less. That may seem insignificant, but probability is how change actually happens, rarely through certainty, usually through accumulation of doubt. This event is doubt made concrete. It exists as a question mark in an otherwise confident landscape. That question mark is easy to overlook, but landscapes change around the question marks. They bend, they adjust, they accommodate. Eventually, the question mark either disappears or becomes central. Which outcome occurs depends on what follows, not on what already happened. This event is done. It will not repeat. it will not change. All that remains is how it is treated, ignored, revisited, reinterpreted, or forgotten. Those choices are not made once. They are made continuously, over time, by many people. This is how meaning emerges, not from events, from engagement. This event invites engagement without offering reward. That makes it difficult, but it also makes it honest. It does not promise resolution. It only promises presence. Presence is enough to matter, sometimes, and that is where Section 3 ends. Not with an answer, but with a condition in which change becomes possible. Living in a reality where some things only ever happen once requires a different posture toward observation, not a different technology, not a different method, a different attitude. Most of what we do assumes repeatability. We plan for it, we expect it, we depend on it. Repeatability makes the world manageable. It allows prediction, it allows control, it allows confidence. But a reality that includes one-time events does not reward those qualities equally. It rewards attentiveness. Attentiveness is not efficiency. It is openness. It is the willingness to pause when nothing demands pausing. It is the decision to look twice when looking once would suffice. This is difficult because attentiveness feels wasteful. It slows things down. It interrupts flow. Most systems are designed to eliminate it. They assume that anything worth noticing will force itself into view. This assumption fails for one-time events. One-time events do not force themselves. They pass through quietly. They do not demand recognition. They offer it. Once. If that offer is not accepted, it is gone. This changes what it means to observe responsibly. Responsibility no longer means thoroughness alone. It means receptivity. Receptivity cannot be automated fully. It depends on judgment. Judgment depends on experience. Experience depends on memory. This creates a fragile chain. Break any link and noticing fails. This is why one-time events are often associated with individuals rather than institutions. Institutions optimize. Individuals hesitate. Hesitation is costly at scale, but it is essential at the margins. This is not an argument against systems. It is an acknowledgement of limits. Systems excel at what repeats. They struggle with what does not. Living in a reality that includes one-time events means accepting that no system will ever be sufficient. There will always be blind spots, not because of failure, but because of design. Design optimizes for goals. Goals exclude. This is unavoidable. What matters is not eliminating blind spots. It is knowing they exist. This knowledge changes behavior. It introduces caution, not caution in action, caution in interpretation. When something does not repeat, the impulse is to explain it away. That impulse feels safe. It restores symmetry. It closes loops. But in a one-time reality, closure may be premature. Premature closure is more dangerous than uncertainty. Uncertainty keeps options open. Closure locks them. This requires restraint. Restraint is not indecision. It is the deliberate choice to leave something unresolved. That choice is uncomfortable. It feels incomplete. But completeness may be an illusion. One-time events expose that illusion. They show that completeness is conditional. It depends on recurrence. Without recurrence, completeness cannot be achieved. Only acknowledgement can. Acknowledgement is weaker than explanation, but it is more honest. It says, something happened, and we do not know what it was. That statement does not feel satisfying, but it is accurate. Accuracy matters more than satisfaction. Living with one-time events also requires humility, not performative humility, structural humility. The humility to admit that understanding is not guaranteed, that not every occurrence is accessible, that some intersections are fleeting by nature. This humility reshapes expectations. It shifts the goal from mastery to awareness. Mastery seeks control. Awareness seeks presence. Presence is enough to notice. Control is not. This is a reversal of values. It does not come easily. Most training emphasizes mastery. We learn to repeat, to refine, to optimize. These skills are valuable, but they do not help with one-time events. They may even hinder, because they encourage dismissal of what cannot be reproduced. Living with one-time events means resisting that reflex, not by abandoning rigor, but by redefining it. Rigor does not always mean explanation. Sometimes it means restraint. The restraint to say, this does not fit, and that matters. That statement keeps the event alive. Not in data, in consideration. Consideration is fragile. It fades quickly without reinforcement. This is why one-time events often disappear from attention. They require active maintenance. Maintenance without payoff is hard to justify. This is where values enter. Do we value completeness or honesty? Do we value closure or accuracy? One-time events force that choice. They reveal preferences. They expose biases. They ask, what kind of observer are you willing to be? An observer who only engages with what can be controlled, or one who remains open to what cannot? This is not a moral question. It is a practical one, because different observers will notice different realities. A reality filtered through repeatability will look stable. A reality filtered through attentiveness will look layered. Neither is wrong, but they are incomplete alone. Living with one-time events requires integration, using systems for what they do well, using human judgment for what systems miss. This balance is difficult. It cannot be formalized easily. It depends on culture. Culture shapes what is rewarded. If only repeatable results are rewarded, one-time events vanish. If attentiveness is valued, they survive longer. This is not about prioritizing anomalies. It is about leaving room for them. Room is not infinite. It must be defended. Defended against efficiency, against optimization, against closure. This defense is subtle. It happens in small decisions. Do you discard or pause? Do you close the file or flag it? Do you move on or sit with discomfort? These decisions accumulate. They shape what a community notices. One-time events test these decisions. They are stress tests for attention. They reveal how much uncertainty a system can tolerate. Most systems tolerate little. They require resolution to function. But living systems tolerate ambiguity. They adapt. This is where one-time events belong, not in rigid frameworks, in adaptive ones. Adaptation does not mean explanation. It means accommodation. Accommodation leaves space. This event was accommodated once. Barely. It survived. That survival required restraint. Restraint from forcing meaning. Restraint from dismissal. That restraint is rare. It is not incentivized. But it is essential for encountering a reality that is not fully repeatable. One-time events are not errors in such a reality. They are features. They represent intersections, moments where trajectories cross. Those moments do not owe us repetition. They do not owe us clarity. They only offer presence. If we miss it, nothing is wrong. Reality continues. But something is lost, not from the world, from our picture of it. That loss is invisible. You cannot measure what you never noticed. This is the hardest part to accept. Living in a one-time reality means accepting permanent incompleteness, not as a temporary limitation, as a condition. This acceptance is not pessimistic. It is liberating. It removes the pressure to explain everything. It allows focus on noticing well. Noticing well does not mean noticing everything. It means noticing honestly, without forcing resolution, without demanding repetition, without assuming significance must be proven. This changes the role of the observer. The observer is no longer a collector of facts. They become a witness. Witnessing does not produce control. It produces record. Record without explanation is often dismissed, but record is enough. Records are how future understanding begins, not immediately, later, when context changes, when thresholds are crossed, when frameworks shift, then old records gain meaning. This event is such a record. It exists for the future, not because it was intended to, but because it survived. Living with one-time events means caring for records, even when they feel useless, especially when they feel useless, because usefulness is contextual. What is useless now may be essential later. This requires patience. Patience is not passive. It is active restraint. It is choosing not to resolve prematurely. That choice is difficult, but it is the only way to remain open to a reality that does not repeat on demand. Future understanding rarely emerges from events that were obvious at the time. It emerges from events that were tolerated, events that were allowed to remain unresolved without being erased. One-time events belong to this category. They do not contribute immediately. They do not explain themselves. They do not align neatly with what is already known. Their value is delayed, not because they are incomplete, but because the context required to understand them does not yet exist. Context is not something that can be generated on demand. It accumulates. It arrives through unrelated developments, through shifts in language, through changes in perspective. When context changes, old records change with it. They are reread, reframed, reinterpreted. This is when one-time events become visible again, not as anomalies, as precursors. This retroactive visibility creates a powerful illusion, the illusion that the event was always pointing towards something. In reality, it was simply waiting, waiting without intention, waiting without promise. Its value was not inherent, it was relational. This is difficult to accept. We prefer to believe that importance is intrinsic, that significant events announce themselves as such. One-time events contradict this. They are indifferent to interpretation. They do not care whether they are understood now or later. They exist once. That existence is their only guarantee. Everything else depends on us. This shifts responsibility, not onto the event, onto the observer. The observer decides whether a record survives long enough to be reinterpreted. Survival is not guaranteed. Most records decay, not physically, conceptually. They lose relevance. They stop being revisited. This is why future understanding is so fragile. It depends on past restraint, restraint from deletion, restraint from closure, restraint from certainty. Without restraint, the past becomes curated too aggressively. Only what fits current understanding remains. Everything else is lost. This creates a narrow future, a future constrained by present assumptions. One-time events resist this narrowing. They sit awkwardly in the archive. They do not fit, but because they do not fit, they preserve possibility. Possibility is the raw material of future understanding. Without it, progress becomes refinement only. Refinement is not discovery. It is optimization. Optimization is valuable, but it does not reveal new layers. One-time events hint at layers we are not yet equipped to explore. They do not reveal those layers directly. They mark their existence indirectly. This indirectness is frustrating. It feels inefficient. But efficiency is not the goal of understanding. Accuracy is. And accuracy requires acknowledging what we cannot yet place. Future understanding often begins with a mismatch, a sense that something in the record does not align. That misalignment becomes more visible as frameworks change. Eventually, what once seemed anomalous becomes obvious, not because the event changed, but because understanding did. This process is slow. It cannot be forced, which means that the value of one-time events is inherently delayed. They are investments without return guarantees. That makes them unattractive. Systems prefer guaranteed returns. This bias explains why so many one-time events are lost, not because they are unimportant, but because they do not justify themselves. They require trust. Trust that future contexts may exist. Trust that restraint now may pay off later. This trust is difficult to justify operationally. It is easier to discard. But discarding reduces future options. It simplifies the archive at the cost of possibility. This trade-off is rarely explicit. It is made unconsciously. One-time events challenge that unconscious process. They ask for conscious choice. Do you preserve what you cannot explain? Or do you remove it to maintain coherence? Coherence feels safer, but it is not always accurate. Future understanding depends on tolerating incoherence, not everywhere, at the margins. This is where one-time events live, at the margins. Their marginality is not a flaw, it is a feature. Margins are where transitions occur. Transitions are where new categories form. This is why one-time events often gain meaning only after a shift. Before the shift, they are noise. After the shift, they are signals. This retroactive transformation is common. It creates narratives of foresight, but foresight is rare. What exists instead is preservation. Someone chose not to erase. Someone chose not to force explanation. Someone allowed ambiguity to persist. That choice made future understanding possible. This is the quiet role of the observer in a one-time reality, not to interpret prematurely, not to demand clarity, but to preserve. Preservation is not passive. It requires effort. It requires defending ambiguity against pressures to resolve. Those pressures are constant. They come from efficiency, from expectations, from desire for closure. Resisting them is difficult, but it is the only way to keep one-time events alive. Alive not as facts, as questions. Questions are more valuable than answers when the framework is incomplete. Answers close paths. Questions keep them open. One-time events generate questions without answers. That is their contribution. Future understanding feeds on those questions. Not immediately, eventually. This creates a long horizon, a horizon that extends beyond current projects, beyond current careers, beyond current frameworks. This is uncomfortable. It asks for patience across timescales larger than individual effort. Most work is not designed for that. But understanding often requires it. This is why one-time events feel unrewarding. They do not validate effort. They do not confirm competence. They simply persist. This persistence is subtle. It does not call attention to itself. It waits for relevance. Relevance arrives unpredictably, sometimes too late to act, but not too late to understand. Understanding does not require recreation. It requires alignment. Alignment between record and framework. This alignment may occur long after the event itself, which means that the value of one-time events is not lost when they vanish. It is stored in records, stored in archives, stored in memory, if those survive. Survival is not guaranteed, which brings us back to the core requirement. Living in a one-time reality requires care. Care for records, care for ambiguity, care for the possibility that meaning is delayed. This care is not glamorous. It does not produce immediate results, but it shapes the future. It determines what can be understood later. Without care, the future inherits a curated past, a past filtered through present assumptions. With care, the future inherits a richer archive, messier, more ambiguous, but more accurate. One-time events demand this care. They do not offer anything else. They cannot be exploited. They cannot be replicated. They cannot be optimized. They can only be remembered. And remembering them honestly means remembering uncertainty, not smoothing it out, not resolving it prematurely, just holding it. This is difficult, but it is the only honest response to a reality that does not repeat on demand. Accepting that some things will never happen again changes the goal of understanding. The goal is no longer completeness. It becomes orientation. Instead of asking for total maps, we learn to navigate fragments. This is not resignation. It is adaptation. A world that contains one-time events cannot be mastered in their traditional sense. It can only be engaged with carefully. Carefully does not mean cautiously. It means attentively. Attentiveness shifts emphasis from prediction to recognition. Prediction assumes repeatability. Recognition does not. Recognition asks only one thing: what is happening now? This question is deceptively simple. It removes the comfort of extrapolation. It forces presence. Presence is difficult. It offers no guarantees. But presence is the only way one-time events can be encountered at all. Once they pass, presence is no longer possible. Only memory remains. Memory without repetition is fragile. It fades. It distorts. It competes with newer, louder events. This fragility is not a weakness of memory. It is a reflection of how the world behaves. The world does not repeat itself for the sake of recall. It moves forward. One-time events are markers of that movement. They indicate that not everything cycles. Some things progress irreversibly. Understanding that requires a shift in mindset, from accumulation to attention, from control to awareness. This shift changes how evidence is valued. In repeatable systems, evidence gains strength through replication. In one-time systems, evidence gains strength through coherence. Not coherence with theory, coherence within itself. Does the event hold together internally? Does it contradict itself? Does it dissolve under scrutiny? If it does not, then its singularity is not a flaw. It is a feature. This reframes what counts as reliability. Reliability is no longer about frequency. It is about integrity. An event that occurs once but remains internally consistent may be more reliable than one that repeats imperfectly. This is counterintuitive. We are trained to distrust singular occurrences. That training is useful, but it is incomplete. It assumes that repetition is always available. In a one-time reality, that assumption fails. So understanding must adapt. Adaptation does not mean abandoning skepticism. It means redirecting it. Skepticism becomes less about asking, "Can this happen again?" and more about asking, "Does this make sense as it stands?" This is a quieter form of rigor. It does not produce certainty. It produces clarity about limits. Clarity about limits is often mistaken for weakness. It is not. It is precision. Knowing where understanding stops is as important as knowing where it works. One-time events define those stopping points. They draw boundaries. Boundaries are uncomfortable. They imply exclusion, but they are necessary. Without boundaries, understanding overreaches. Overreach produces false confidence. False confidence is dangerous. It hides ignorance behind authority. One-time events resist that. They refuse to be absorbed into confident narratives. They remain unresolved. That unresolved state is honest. Honesty is not satisfying, but it is accurate. This acceptance changes how explanations are treated. Explanations become provisional. They are no longer endpoints. They are tools. Tools for orientation, not closure. This is a subtle but important shift. It prevents explanation from becoming dogma. Dogma thrives on repeatability. It relies on consistency to justify authority. One-time events undermine dogma by existing outside its reach. They do not contradict it directly. They simply bypass it. This bypass is destabilizing, but it is also liberating. It reminds us that no framework is total, that reality always exceeds description. This excess is not a failure of language. It is a property of the world. Language compresses. Reality expands. There will always be mismatch. One-time events are extreme cases of that mismatch. They compress poorly. They resist reduction. Accepting this changes how we look at absence. Absence is no longer assumed to be emptiness. It may be misalignment. It may be timing. It may be missed presence. This makes absence ambiguous. Ambiguity is uncomfortable, but it is honest. It reflects the limits of access. Access is not guaranteed. This realization reshapes expectations. We stop expecting the world to reveal itself fully. We stop demanding that every phenomenon justify itself through repetition. We accept that some encounters are gifts, brief, unrepeatable, incomplete. Gifts are not useful in the usual sense. They are meaningful. Meaning is not the same as utility. Utility seeks outcomes. Meaning reshapes perspective. One-time events reshape perspective. They remind us that understanding is not a conquest. It is a relationship. Relationships do not guarantee repetition. They depend on timing, on presence, on openness. You cannot demand that someone repeat a moment. You can only be present when it happens. Reality behaves similarly. Some moments cannot be revisited. They are not failures of method. They are expressions of temporality. Time moves forward. Some intersections occur only once. Understanding that requires letting go of a deep expectation. The expectation that knowledge accumulates monotonically. that once something is seen, it can always be seen again. This expectation is false. Many things are lost, not because they are unimportant, but because time moved on. Accepting this loss changes how we value observation. Observation becomes precious, not because it produces data, but because it produces encounter. Encounters are rare. They cannot be scheduled. They cannot be replicated. They happen when conditions align. One-time events are pure encounters. They reveal that reality is not obligated to repeat itself for our benefit. This acceptance alters ambition. Instead of trying to see everything, the goal becomes seeing well. Seeing well means noticing without forcing, recording without over-interpreting, preserving without demanding payoff. This is difficult. It runs counter to incentives, but it is the only posture that respects a one-time reality. It also changes how we relate to uncertainty. Uncertainty is no longer a temporary obstacle. It becomes a permanent companion, not an enemy, a guide. It points to limits. Limits are informative. They tell us where not to push too hard, where to pause, where to observe rather than intervene. One-time events demand this restraint. They cannot be controlled. They cannot be reproduced. They can only be acknowledged. Acknowledgement is a form of understanding. Not total understanding, but partial. Partial understanding is still understanding. This may feel unsatisfying, but satisfaction is not the measure of truth. Truth is often uncomfortable. It disrupts expectations. One-time events disrupt the expectation of mastery. They remind us that we are participants, not overseers. Participants encounter. Overseers control. Control requires repetition. Participation requires presence. Presence is fragile. It cannot be automated. It depends on attention. Attention is finite. This finitude defines what can be known. Accepting that changes priorities. We stop trying to eliminate uncertainty. We start managing it. Managing uncertainty means leaving space. Space for things that do not fit. Space for events that occur once. Space for records that resist interpretation. This space is where future understanding grows, not immediately, later, when conditions change, when frameworks shift, when language evolves. Then old records become legible, not because they changed, but because we did. This is the final gift of one-time events. They future-proof understanding. They ensure that the past remains richer than present explanations. They prevent closure from becoming stagnation. They keep questions alive. This is not comfortable, but it is necessary. A world without one-time events would be predictable. It would also be closed. A world with them remains open, unfinished, dynamic. That openness is not chaos. It is possibility. Possibility requires humility. Humility requires restraint. Restraint allows attention. Attention makes noticing possible. Noticing is where understanding begins. Not always with answers, sometimes with silence, and sometimes with the quiet knowledge that something happened once, and that is enough. When the entire structure is stripped down, what remains is not mystery, it is limitation. Not a dramatic limitation, not a failure, a structural one, a limitation built into how observation works. We tend to think of limits as obstacles to overcome, but some limits are not obstacles. They are boundaries, and boundaries are informative. They tell us where our tools stop being effective. They tell us where certainty dissolves into encounter. One-time events sit exactly at that boundary. They are not errors. They are not messages. They are indicators. Indicators that reality does not scale itself to comprehension. This realization is not new. What is new is how rarely it is acknowledged, because acknowledging it weakens a comforting narrative. The narrative that given enough data, enough time, enough refinement, everything becomes clear. One-time events contradict that. They say, some things do not return, not because they are rare, but because they are finished. Finished does not mean resolved. It means complete in themselves. This is difficult to accept, because we associate completeness with understanding. But completeness can exist without explanation. An event can be whole without being interpretable. This event was whole. It did not fragment. It did not trail off. It did not degrade. It occurred, and then it ended. That ending is not a failure of analysis. It is the nature of the event. Once this is accepted, something changes. The question shifts. It is no longer, what was it? It becomes, what does it mean that something like this can happen once and never again? That question does not seek content. It seeks implication. The implication is this: reality is not obligated to offer repeat performances, and knowledge built entirely on repetition is necessarily incomplete. This does not invalidate knowledge. It contextualizes it. It places it within a larger environment, an environment that includes events which intersect us briefly and then move on. These events do not threaten understanding. They define its edges. Edges are not weaknesses. They are where growth occurs. But growth does not always mean expansion. Sometimes it means restraint. Restraint from claiming too much. Restraint from forcing resolution. Restraint from assuming access. One-time events demand that restraint. They teach it implicitly. They teach that not everything can be revisited, that not every record can be interrogated again, that some things are known only by having happened. This is uncomfortable, but it is honest. And honesty is more durable than certainty. Certainty breaks when it is overextended. Honesty adapts. This event does not ask to be believed. It does not ask to be explained. It only asks to be acknowledged. Acknowledgement is a modest demand. It does not distort models. It does not force conclusions. It simply leaves a marker that says something occurred here, and our frameworks did not fully capture it. That marker is valuable, not because it reveals something specific, but because it reveals a relationship, the relationship between observer and observed, a relationship that is contingent, that depends on timing, on alignment, on presence. Once that relationship is understood, expectations shift. We stop assuming inevitability. We stop assuming repetition. We stop assuming that importance announces itself. Instead, we recognize that significance may pass quietly, that some of the most meaningful intersections leave no trail. This does not make reality hostile. It makes it indifferent. Indifference is not malice. It is scale. The universe does not optimize for legibility. It optimizes for nothing at all. Things happen. Some repeat. Some do not. We happen to be present for a fraction of them. This event happened to intersect us. Once. That is not a gift. It is not a warning. It is a fact. What matters is how that fact is treated. It can be forced into explanation. It can be minimized. It can be forgotten. Or it can be held as unresolved. Holding something unresolved is not weakness. It is discipline. Discipline to admit that understanding has limits. Discipline to resist the urge to close prematurely. This discipline is rare, but it is what allows knowledge to remain open. Open knowledge is resilient. It can absorb revision. It can accommodate surprise. Closed knowledge cannot. One-time events pressure knowledge to remain open. They are stress tests, not of technology, of humility. This event passed that test narrowly. It survived, not fully integrated, not dismissed, suspended. That suspension is its legacy. It remains as a quiet reference, a reminder that observation is not ownership, that detection is not dominion, that some things will always exist beyond reach. This does not diminish the value of what we know. It deepens it, because it frames knowledge as partial by design, not temporarily incomplete, structurally partial. This framing changes ambition. We no longer aim to see everything. We aim to see clearly what we can, and to acknowledge what we cannot. This balance is difficult, but it is the only balance that respects a world where some things happen once and never again. This event does not ask to be revisited. It cannot be. It does not ask to be solved. It may never be. It only exists as a reminder that reality is not curated for comprehension, that some intersections are fleeting, and that noticing them at all is contingent. That contingency is not failure. It is condition. Living within that condition requires patience, restraint, and attentiveness. Those qualities do not produce answers quickly, but they preserve honesty. Honesty is the foundation of real understanding, not certainty, not mastery. Honesty about what we saw, honesty about what we lost, honesty about what may never return. This event belongs to that honesty. It exists as something that happened once, was noticed once, and left without explanation. That is not a weakness. It is a boundary, and boundaries matter because they tell us where understanding ends and where respect for the unknown begins, and that is enough.